Teach me to do thy will, for thou art my God. Thy spirit is good. Lead me into the land of uprightness. To David, who God used to write this passage here, God was not just an idea or a theological concept. For David, who the Bible calls the man after God's own heart, God was not merely one facet or one aspect of his life that he compartmentalized. A lot of times that's kind of how our lives are, is it not? You know, we have our God part of our life, and we have our friends part of our life, and we have this part of our life and that part of our life. I don't think that's how it was for David, at least at this time that he was writing these verses. David cried, "Thou art," and I love these next two words, "my God." And I just want to remind the young people, as I listened to Pastor Markey challenge you guys before he left. I think it was the message he preached at the spring banquet. He talked, I believe that message was out of the book of Ruth, where Ruth said, your God shall be my God. And David prayed here, and he said, "Thou art my God, my God." Not his parents' God, not his nation's God, but my God is what he said. And this was not empty talk on David's part. This wasn't empty talk. There's a lot of empty talk that goes on, right? In churches, in our own lives, I've been guilty of empty talk. I hate empty talk. Okay? I hate it. I hate it and I can sense it when I'm doing it, and I just hate it. I truly want to be sincere in my life. I want to sincerely serve the Lord. This wasn't empty talk. This wasn't vain religious babble. This was not church lingo that he was talking about here. For David, his relationship with God was so real that David came to the only right conclusion that a person can come to who cries out these words, "Thou art my God." And this was the proof right here. He said, "Thou art my God," but the first words of this verse say, "Teach me to do thy will." Teach me to do thy will. The evidence of the reality and closeness of David's relationship with God was proven with the words, "Teach me to do thy will." It's not that David had no will of his own. He most surely did. He did not say in this verse, "I'm going to do your will." He didn't say that. He said, "Teach me to do your will. Teach me to do your will." The implication is that doing the will of God did not come naturally for David. Because David, like the rest of us, had a will of his own. He said, "Teach me to do thy will." Now, why in the world would anybody go to another person and say, "Teach me to do something"? Because it's something that person isn't yet familiar with, right? Isn't yet good at, doesn't yet have any experience with. And so David was coming to God and he said, "I need you to teach me something, God. Teach me to do your will, because it doesn't come naturally to me." He had to be taught to deny his natural wayward ways, his will. It's amazing how strong our wills are, isn't it? And I mean, even, it's just so funny. Evelyn, who's 9 months old, I've started to see her will come out. Just in the past week, she started doing this thing with her lip. She starts pushing, like she does this little underbite face and pushes her lip out. And it's if to say, "I'm going to do what I want." And her favorite thing to do is to go up to the night lights that we have throughout the house. And her favorite thing to do is to go up and take the covers off the night lights for some reason. And if she can, she'll rip the whole night light out. And of course, we don't allow her to do that. But it's amazing how strong her will is, even at 9 months old. Now, over time, our wills become cemented. And if we never come to a point where our will is broken, and we never come to a point where we're teachable and say, Lord, teach me to do your will, our will can actually be one of the most self-destructive forces in our lives. And David was saying, teach me to do your will, Lord. And this had to be a continual thing. He didn't say, teach me one time. It was the idea is that this is some teaching that I'm going to need for the rest of my life. Teach me. This is my prayer, Lord. Teach me, teach me, teach me to do your will. To deny the most powerful force that a human possesses, which is his own will. But this is very important that I want you to understand. This prayer that he was praying was not a lamentation. In other words, it wasn't, oh, Lord, I guess I'm going to have to do your will. I mean, I guess, go ahead and teach me to do your will. It wasn't a lamentation. Even though David had a will of his own that, like us, was strong and seemed to be the greatest reality of his life. And isn't that true? Most of the time, the greatest reality of our life is what we sense when we're getting our own way. That's what reality is to us. But really, and we're going to talk about this here in a minute, the greatest reality, the only time that we truly experience true reality is when we're submitted to God and walking with God in a close relationship, because that's why we were made. And when we're living our life for anything other than a relationship with God, we're not living in reality. We think we're living in reality, but we're not really living in it. We're living in this dream world that we've kind of contrived in our own mind. This was no lamentation. Even though David had a will of his own that seemed to be the greatest reality, he prayed in such a manner that he recognized the superiority of God's will to his own. And he prayed, listen, he prayed as a man who was gaining something of unspeakably precious value, not as one who was losing anything. Jesus said, whosoever loseth his life shall find it. And he also said, let him that cometh after me deny what or whom? Deny himself. Deny himself. And that's essentially what David was doing. This is what you see in this verse. He's saying, teach me to do not my will. Teach me to do thy will. He was coming and he was yielding up his own will. But the sense that we get from this verse wasn't that in doing that in giving up my own will, oh no, I'm losing something. Oh no, now I'm not going to have any success, and now I'm losing something. No, the sense that we get from this verse is, Lord God, this is what I need. I'm gaining something. When I forsake my own will to follow after God and to seek God's will, listen, we're not losing anything there, except that which would destroy us. Our own will, yes, will destroy us, and different people's self-destruction has different, it looks different for everybody. Some people self-destruct while surrounded by wealth and riches. But spiritually, they're dead. Spiritually, they're far from God. What David prayed in Psalm 143:10, teach me to do thy will, O God, for thou art my God. And then the words of Jesus, where Jesus said, whosoever loseth his life shall find it. Let him that cometh after me deny himself. I believe these concepts go hand in hand. Why would anyone willingly lay aside his or her will? I mean, doesn't this just fly in the face of our culture? Doesn't this just fly in the face of what we're taught by our society? Society presents a quote-unquote reality that says there's nothing greater that you can do than to pursue your own ambitions and dreams. And don't let anyone ever talk you out of doing that. They laugh at the idea of doing the will of God. They laugh at that idea. Or following God's plan. You know, people who do this kind of nonsense, following God's will, this invisible God that you can't even see, and you're gonna surrender your life to Him and do what He has laid out in His Word, and you're gonna submit, and you're gonna have a humble spirit. What in the world? Who do you think you are? You know, who are you? And they think that those of us who are trying to live that way are just not living in the real world, you know. But Jesus teaches us something that David clearly understood in Psalm 143:10, and that is that the only people who are living in reality are those who have and walk in a relationship with God. And here's how the relationship goes. Here's the relationship with God. And I feel like this is going to be Pastor Markey-esque right here, you know. I mean, this is real deep, all right? God is God, and we're not. Pretty simple, right? God's God, and we're not God. And to walk with God in the only proper way, in order to do that, we must pray as David prayed. Teach me, O God, to do Thy will. I can't be properly related to God and be hardened in my own ways at the same time. It's impossible. Because God's God and I'm not. I'm not God. And here's the thing. When we're kind of living life on our terms, we think we're God. When we make decisions without ever one time praying and seeking God's face, we're basically being our own God. We're not allowing God to be God. You know, when we realize that we were made to be worshipers, that's a pretty simple concept to understand. But we don't always like to admit that. I know the world doesn't want to admit that. That we were made, I mean, boy, you talk about, you want to make a secular humanist angry. Tell them that they were made to be a worshiper, not of themselves, but of God. That'll really make them mad. But don't we all have it in us to worship something? I mean, you know, we worship. I mean, I remember growing up and there were certain athletes that I just worshiped. I mean, I felt like if I could ever actually meet this person in person, I could just die happy right there, you know. I mean, why do we get that way? You know? Why do this is going to sound ridiculous, and it probably is, and if it is, forgive me. But why do teenage girls go to Justin Bieber concerts and literally pass out? I mean, they faint. You know, he spits on them and they faint. Because it's in them to worship. It's in them to worship. We were made to be worshipers. We were made for a relationship with God. And by the way, the people who claim that they weren't made to worship, and yet they're worshiping all these other things, they never really understand what life's all about, do they? They never get it. They never understand reality. We were made for a relationship with God. Then and only then are we able to understand and live in reality, but to live our lives independently of God. Listen, to merely nod our head in acknowledgement to Him, but not to give Him His rightful place as our shepherd, as the shepherd of our lives. To live this way is to live in a dream world of our own making, because we believe that we will find life apart from the very source of life. God's the very source of physical life. He's the very source of spiritual life. And if we think that we're going to find fulfillment, if we think we're going to find life apart from the very source of life, we are gravely mistaken. There's a greater reality, and I believe the only true reality, and that is that I live to please God and to do His will, regardless of what people say, this is the right thing to do. I want to just ask just a few questions tonight, and then I'll close. I've basically just read to you from my journal some things that God did in my heart, has been doing in my heart, and had never written it out before. But I just wrote down some questions tonight that I need to ask myself, and I hope that you'll contemplate these things as well. Number one, do we realize that the only way we can truly say, "Thou art my God," is to also say, "Teach me to do thy will"? I want to read that question one more time. Actually, let me read the verse one more time and notice the flow of the verse. Just notice the flow of this verse. He says, "Teach me to do thy will." Now, why would you ask somebody to, why would he say that? He said because you're God. And if I'm going to walk with you, the only right way, the only way that it's going to work is when I'm submitted to your will, not the other way around. Right? It's the only way that I can walk with you, God. He was acknowledging that. The only way I can walk with you, Lord, is when I submit to you. When I say, "Teach me to do thy will." So I'm going to ask this question again. Do we realize that the only way we can truly say, "Thou art my God," is to also say, "Teach me to do thy will"? Number two, do we see this submission to God's will as something that should be lamented or something to be rejoiced in? Do we see this submitting to God, yielding to God, do we see that in a negative sense? Or do we see that as when I do yield to God, when I yield Him my life, when I yield Him my heart, I'm not really losing anything. The only thing I'm losing is my self-destructive will. But I have everything to gain by doing that. I have the peace of God. I have the peace of God that comes with knowing that I'm following the only one who's worthy to be called the Good Shepherd. Number three, do we understand that to know God and walk with Him is the only true reality? Because in doing this, we live as we were created to live. Do we realize that to live independently of a relationship with God is in essence to live apart from the very source of life? Do we understand that? Do we realize that? Pastor Feast.